The night sky over southern Russia exploded in a series of blinding white flashes. It was 10:27 p.m., January 21st, 2026, when a Ukrainian FP-2 unmanned aerial vehicle lifted off from the coastline of Odessa Oblast. Within hours, one of Russia's most critical energy arteries would be severed, triggering a cascade of economic and military consequences that would send shockwaves through the Kremlin. What happened that night wasn't just another drone strike. It was a calculated blow that exposed the fragility of Putin's war machine and raised urgent questions about his leadership as Russia's fuel crisis spirals out of control. Russia's energy infrastructure has been hemorrhaging for months, and the January 21st strike delivered what may prove to be a fatal wound. The timing couldn't have been worse for Moscow. Since October 2025, Russian refined product output has plummeted as several major refineries shut down for emergency repairs following relentless Ukrainian drone attacks. The strikes haven't been random acts of desperation. They've been surgical strikes designed to maximize long-term damage while minimizing Ukraine's resource expenditure. The scale of destruction is staggering. Intelligence assessments indicate that the coordinated assault targeted multiple critical nodes in Russia's oil distribution network, potentially affecting up to 900,000 tons of petroleum products. At current market rates, this translates to approximately $450 million in direct losses. But the real damage extends far beyond these immediate figures. The attack has disrupted supply chains feeding multiple Russian mechanized divisions, threatened fuel supplies to occupied territories, and exposed catastrophic vulnerabilities in what Moscow once touted as an impregnable defense network. What makes this disaster particularly devastating is its context. Russia is already reeling from a cascading fuel crisis that has left half of Crimea's gas stations completely dry. The Far East and Volga Federal District face severe shortages as supply chains stretch dangerously thin. Reports suggest Moscow has been weighing production cuts due to sustained drone attacks, a claim pipeline monopoly Transneft rushed to deny, underscoring how sensitive the Kremlin has become to any hint of fragility in its energy sector. The operation demonstrated the sophistication that has become Ukraine's signature in this asymmetric conflict. The FP-2 drone that launched from Odessa Oblast on that January evening was part of a coordinated swarm designed to overwhelm Russian air defenses through sheer numbers and tactical deception. These weren't crude, improvised weapons. They were purpose-built platforms engineered to exploit specific weaknesses in Russia's vaunted S-400 and Pantsir air defense systems. Ukrainian military planners have spent the past year studying Russian defensive postures, identifying blind spots, and developing countermeasures. The drones employed in the January strike utilized a combination of low-altitude flight profiles, radar-absorbent materials, and electronic warfare capabilities to penetrate hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory. Some carried thermite charges designed to burn through critical infrastructure at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to turn steel rails and pipeline valves into molten slag. The targets weren't chosen arbitrarily. Ukraine's intelligence services identified key nodes where oil and refined products were stored, processed, or transported to military units. Striking these facilities creates cascading effects that reverberate through Russia's entire logistical network. A single successful hit on a pumping station can shut down oil flow for weeks. Destroying storage tanks eliminates reserves that take months to rebuild. Severing rail lines forces lengthy detours that strain an already overburdened transportation system. Russian air defense operators that night faced an impossible calculus. Radar screens lit up with dozens of incoming targets approaching from multiple vectors. Some flew at wave-top height, using the Earth's curvature to mask their approach until the final seconds. Others climbed to higher altitudes, deploying corner reflectors that created radar signatures mimicking much larger cruise missiles. The Russian commanders had to make split-second decisions about which threats to engage first. And in that hesitation, the real strike package slipped through. The January 21st attack didn't create Russia's fuel crisis. It accelerated a disaster that's been building for months. Since Ukrainian drones began systematically targeting refineries in 2024, Russia's refining capacity has collapsed by nearly a fifth on some days, with exports from key ports sharply curtailed. The domestic impact has been devastating. Ordinary Russians queue for hours at gas stations, only to find pumps dry. Farmers fear their machinery will grind to a halt during critical planting and harvest seasons. Truckers face financial ruin as fuel shortages make long-haul operations impossible. The Kremlin's response has been a masterclass in deflection and denial. State propagandists claim shortages are merely scheduled oil refinery maintenance, or temporary, objective factors, like transport bottlenecks and bad weather. Meanwhile, regional officials quietly admit that rationing is very real. Deputy Prime Minister 𝙄𝙣𝙨𝙞𝙜𝙝 disclosed that the government would extend the ban on gasoline exports through the end of 2025 and impose diesel export bans on non-producers. He admitted some regions still face shortages, but insisted they were covered by accumulated reserves, a claim that rings hollow as those reserves evaporate. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov declared that Russian citizens are completely united around President Putin and ready to shoulder any burden, insisting the state remains balanced, predictable, and stable. But this stability is an illusion maintained through information control and repression. The reality on the ground tells a different story, one of frustration, hardship, and growing questions about leadership competence. The economic implications extend far beyond consumer inconvenience. Every fix comes at mounting cost, draining reserves and exposing how brittle the foundations of Putin's so-called energy superpower have become. The finance ministry, intent on making ordinary Russians shoulder the burden, has pushed to raise VAT from 20 to 22% to fund defense and security. This isn't sacrifice, it's extortion of a population already under pressure. Understanding the true scale of this disaster requires looking beyond immediate dollar figures. The $450 million in lost oil and damaged infrastructure represents just the tip of the iceberg. The January strike targeted facilities that were already operating at reduced capacity due to previous attacks. Repairing this damage will take months, possibly years, requiring specialized equipment and expertise that Russia increasingly lacks due to Western sanctions. Consider the cascading economic effects. Every day these facilities remain offline, Russia loses revenue that funds its war effort. The attack on the January 21st targets reportedly disrupted supply lines, feeding 3 mechanized divisions preparing for offensive operations. Without adequate fuel, tanks become stationary targets, armored personnel carriers sit idle, and logistics vehicles can't deliver ammunition and supplies to frontline units. The military cost of this single strike potentially exceeds the immediate infrastructure damage by an order of magnitude. Then there's the psychological impact. Russian military planners believed that moving critical infrastructure deeper into Russian territory would provide protection. The success of long-range Ukrainian drone strikes has shattered that illusion. No oil depot, no refinery, no storage facility is now safe. This forces Russia to divert air defense systems from protecting military units at the front to guarding rear-area economic targets, a strategic nightmare that thins defensive coverage across the board. Insurance markets have taken notice. International maritime insurance companies have dramatically increased premiums for tankers calling at Russian ports following repeated Ukrainian strikes. Some carriers refuse to dock at previously profitable terminals, forcing Russia to rely increasingly on aging, poorly maintained vessels in its shadow fleet, ships that operate outside international regulations and pose environmental catastrophe risks. Russia's oil disasters extend beyond military strikes. The December 2024 Black Sea oil spill, when two aging Russian tankers released thousands of tons of heavy fuel oil during a storm, caused an estimated 84.9 billion rubles, $1 billion, in environmental damage. The incident exposed the decrepit state of Russia's civilian maritime infrastructure and highlighted the environmental price of Putin's war economy. The tankers involved, Volganeft 212 and Volganeft 239, were relics that should have been retired decades ago. Volganeft 212 split in half and sank, releasing approximately 4,900 tons of mazut, a particularly toxic form of heavy fuel oil. By December 23, 2024, up to 200,000 tons of sand had become polluted. A regional state of emergency was declared in 𝙄𝙣𝙨 on December 25th, followed by a federal emergency declaration by President Putin. Putin himself criticized the response during a January 9, 2025 cabinet meeting, saying, "From what I see and from the information I receive, I conclude that everything being done to minimize the damage is clearly not enough yet." This rare public admission of government incompetence revealed cracks in the carefully maintained facade of control. The transportation minister determined that the main cause of the accident was the failure of the captains and owners to comply with seasonal navigation restrictions, and that ships were staffed with unqualified personnel. The environmental damage continues spreading. Satellite images show oil slicks continuing to appear near wreck sites as recently as March 2025, despite no new spills being officially reported. Volunteers and emergency crews have worked for months to remove oil and contaminated sand from beaches in the Krasnodar region and annexed Crimea. The tanker's owners face lawsuits totaling billions of rubles, money they almost certainly don't have. As Russia's fuel crisis deepens and military setbacks mount, questions about Putin's visibility and leadership have grown more urgent. The autocrat who once projected strength through carefully staged public appearances has become notably more reclusive. Official statements increasingly come through intermediaries rather than direct presidential addresses. When Putin does appear, the settings are carefully controlled, the audience is pre-screened, and the messages heavily scripted. This retreat from public view isn't merely about image management. It reflects genuine security concerns and political calculation. Multiple credible reports suggest Putin now operates from secure bunkers for extended periods, venturing out only for essential state functions. The paranoia isn't unjustified. Ukraine has demonstrated the ability to strike targets deep inside Russia, including locations previously considered impregnable. The January 21st oil strike proved that nowhere in Russia is truly safe from Ukrainian reach. Political analysts note that Putin's reduced visibility coincides with increasingly dire economic reports and military stalemates. The fuel crisis presents a particular problem because it directly impacts ordinary Russians' daily lives in ways that even battlefield casualties don't. Empty gas pumps, cold homes, and rising prices create tangible dissatisfaction that no amount of state propaganda can fully suppress. Putin's historical strategy has been to maintain domestic support by projecting competence and delivering economic stability. Both pillars are now crumbling. The Kremlin's response to this crisis reveals desperation. Rather than acknowledge problems and present realistic solutions, officials double down on denial and blame external enemies. This approach worked when Russia's difficulties could be attributed to Western sanctions or Ukrainian terrorism. But when half of Crimea's gas stations sit empty and farmers can't fuel their equipment, the narrative becomes harder to maintain. Putin's invisibility during this crisis suggests a leader unsure how to address failures that undermine his entire claim to legitimacy. The brilliance of Ukraine's campaign against Russian oil infrastructure lies not in any single strike, but in the cumulative strategic effect. Each successful attack forces Russia to make difficult choices about resource allocation. Protecting refineries means fewer air defense systems at the front. Repairing damaged facilities diverts money and materials from weapons production. Rerouting oil flows around damaged infrastructure strains an already overstretched logistics network. The cost asymmetry is devastating for Russia. Ukraine uses drones costing thousands of dollars to destroy facilities worth hundreds of millions. A $500,000 underwater drone sank a $500 million submarine in Novorossiysk. Modified racing drones worth $4,800 destroyed $127 million in Russian military assets and severed the only rail line feeding 3 mechanized divisions. This 1 to 1,000 cost ratio is a burden the Russian economy cannot sustain. Ukrainian military planners have studied Russian defensive psychology and exploited it ruthlessly. Russian commanders expect threats to follow certain patterns. Missiles from certain directions, attacks at certain altitudes, operations during specific weather conditions. Ukraine deliberately violates these expectations, forcing Russian operators to make decisions under uncertainty. When you can't predict where the next strike will come from or what form it will take, you must defend everywhere, which means you defend nowhere effectively. The timing of strikes maximizes chaos. Hitting facilities during shift changes exploits momentary gaps in readiness. Striking during severe weather when repair crews face hazardous conditions extends damage duration. Attacking multiple targets simultaneously forces Russian emergency response systems to prioritize, ensuring some fires burn longer and some casualties receive delayed treatment. Putin now faces a strategic dilemma with no good solutions. He can't end the war without admitting defeat, which would undermine his entire political foundation. He can't escalate decisively without risking Western intervention or domestic collapse. He can't continue indefinitely because Ukraine's asymmetric warfare strategy is bleeding Russia's economy and military strength at an unsustainable rate. The fuel crisis epitomizes this trap. Russia needs its refineries to generate revenue to fund the war. But the war makes those refineries targets. Defending them requires air defense systems that are desperately needed at the front. Repairing them requires resources that could otherwise go to weapons production. Insurance costs and transportation inefficiencies eat into profit margins, reducing the funds available for military spending. Meanwhile, Ukrainian strikes aren't just destroying facilities, they're attacking Russia's credibility with international partners. China, India, and other countries that have continued buying Russian oil despite Western sanctions are nervous about supply reliability. If Russian facilities can be struck at will, if ports can be closed by drone attacks, if pipelines can be severed without warning, then Russia becomes an unreliable supplier. This pushes customers toward alternative sources, reducing Russia's market share and future revenue, even if current damage is eventually repaired. The political dimension is equally treacherous. Putin built his legitimacy on promises of stability, prosperity, and restored Russian greatness. Empty gas pumps and cold apartments directly contradict all 3 promises. State propaganda can spin military setbacks as temporary tactical adjustments or heroic defense against Western aggression. It's much harder to explain why citizens can't buy gasoline when Russia is supposedly an energy superpower. The January 21st strike represents a turning point in Russia's energy war. The combination of direct military attacks, environmental disasters, and structural economic weaknesses has created a perfect storm that threatens Putin's entire war effort. The loss of 900,000 tons of oil and $450 million in infrastructure damage would be manageable for a healthy economy. For a Russia already staggering under sanctions, military expenditures, and cascading failures across its energy sector, it may prove catastrophic. Ukraine has demonstrated that it possesses both the capability and the will to strike deep into Russian territory, targeting the economic foundations of Putin's war machine. These aren't terror attacks against civilians. They're precisely calibrated strikes against military logistics and economic infrastructure. Each successful mission degrades Russia's ability to sustain offensive operations, forces difficult resource allocation decisions, and undermines domestic confidence in government competence. Putin's apparent retreat from public view during this crisis suggests a leader uncertain how to navigate these challenges. The autocrat who once projected invincibility now hides while his country's infrastructure burns and ordinary citizens face daily hardships. This contrast between propaganda and reality cannot be maintained indefinitely. Something will eventually break, whether it's Russia's economy, Putin's political control, or the cohesion of his military forces remains to be seen. For Ukraine and its Western partners, the strategy is clear. Continue applying pressure across multiple domains simultaneously. Military strikes degrade Russia's warfighting capability. Economic sanctions limit its ability to rebuild and rearm. Information operations expose the gap between Kremlin propaganda and lived reality. This comprehensive approach doesn't require defeating Russia militarily in a traditional sense. It requires making the cost of continuing the war higher than Putin's political system can bear. The smoke rising from burning oil facilities across Russia tells a story that no amount of state propaganda can obscure. Putin's energy superpower is fragile, his military vulnerable, and his leadership increasingly disconnected from the crisis consuming his country. The January 21st disaster may be remembered not as an isolated incident, but as the moment when Russia's war effort began its irreversible decline. Whether Putin emerges from hiding to confront these realities or continues his retreat into denial will determine not just the war's outcome, but Russia's future for decades to come. The world watches as Russia burns, literally and figuratively. The flames illuminating the January night sky weren't just consuming oil and infrastructure, they were incinerating the myths of Russian invincibility, exposing the hollowness of Putin's promises, and illuminating a path toward Ukrainian victory that grows clearer with each successful strike. The question is no longer whether Russia can win this war, but whether its energy infrastructure and economy can survive long enough for Putin to accept the inevitable.